Hey there, listeners. Welcome to the latest episode of the podcast of Record. It is the week of May the 4th. We're in May already. Bye-bye April. Quarantine April is gone out the door. And now we've moved on from coronavirus to be concerned about murder hornets. So
No, I've seen the
a new
murder
thing.
hornets.
Yeah, that's a new thing.
In
Wildlife.
person?
Just I saw the
No,
stories
just
about
the
murder
pictures.
Oh,
hornets.
okay.
Yeah,
I was going to say you saw one in person.
No, it's only a West Coast thing right now, I think. Because just like coronavirus, it was, to my understanding, delivered to the United States from Asia. So they just keep sending them on over. Don't like the coronavirus? We'll hit you with murder hornets.
You'll be grateful for the coronavirus.
I did see a solid conspiracy theory that the murder hornets are actually small government drones.
Yeah,
Yes.
obviously they're drones, like birds.
They kept us all
But we
inside with
figured
the
out birds.
coronavirus, so
Yeah.
they could launch the mini drone swarm. That being said, if you're still listening, welcome to the latest episode. We're going to talk today.
We promise we'll talk at some point about marketing and advertising.
That's not guaranteed. We're going to talk today about what things look like after reopening. We're going to go sector by sector. We're going to talk about all the major things that have been affected by the coronavirus and the quarantine. Of course, as you know, this is the first week where states have been given, I don't want to call it a green light, we'll call it a yellow light to start some reopening processes. Here in Florida, the governor let some restaurants open with limited capacity and has let some other businesses unfortunately not barbers or haircuts yet. So my wife gave me a haircut last week. It wasn't too bad. But she's probably not going to listen to the podcast, so I'm not worried about saying anything because she never listens.
I asked my husband if he would let me do his hair, and he said he would rather shave his head. So there's that.
I mean, she didn't do a bad job. I'm not complaining. There's one little kind of bald spot over here on the side above the ear where she got too short. But overall, it was fairly good. I'm not complaining. I bought a little set of hair clippers from the pharmacy. And I'm a little slap happy right now because I've been up all night with a baby with a fever who just wouldn't stop crying. But that being said, Joe, what sector do you want to talk about first with reopening?
Well, you just talked about going to the pharmacy, so let's spin the wheel and lands on retail.
Wheel
what do you
of
know?
Fugitives.
So the first thing, we'll talk about industry by industry is what happened in the industry during the virus. What are the industries trying to do in response? And then where does everything shake out by year's end? So when you look at retail, what happened in the industry during the virus is essentially the bigger players in the space got to stay open and the smaller players in the space effectively had to close.
Depending on what kind of retail you were, though, right? Like you were okay if you were a Target or a Publix. You were not okay if you were a Dillard's.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's, a good, like a mall retailer, which kind of is the next thing. So what has the industry tried to do? Well, a lot of your mall type retailers just tried to survive, and that hasn't worked for several of them. So I think you have a Victoria's Secret proceeding to bankruptcy, Neiman Marcus proceeding to bankruptcy.
J. Crew already filed.
What?
J. Crew filed.
J. Crew. I saw JCPenney suing Sephora to keep them from taking their makeup counters out of JCPenney stores. So you accelerated probably by 3 or 4 years, just the bricks and mortar, retail apocalypse. On the other hand, I think businesses like Costco, like Amazon, which will probably come up in most of these sector discussions, Walmart, and to some extent Target, CVS, Walgreens are all doing, I would imagine, had very good quarters in Q1. And then, and so here is, I think, where the discussion point is, where do we think retail is headed? Where do we think retail is by the end of the year? What does that market look like? And how is that market communicating to consumers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. And I'm assuming we're talking about bricks and mortar retail, right? Because online retail is doing, not great, but is, sustainable.
Yeah, and I have a DTC and tech issue on the wheel, so I think the online retail kind of gets blurred into a few of these.
Sure.
But you could talk about that, because, these stores are selling online. What's pulling them down, especially the apparel retailers, is they have these rents they have to pay on stores, which basically generate no revenue right now.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that the retailers that had made a strong move to e-commerce already are going to, be able to weather the storm a little bit better. So, Gap and Old Navy, like you said, they've got some pretty big rent bills due over the next few months, but at least there's a huge portion of Gap and Old Navy commerce that already happens over the internet. So they're still able to sell things. Arguably, they may be selling more right now as people are looking for more
Yeah.
loungewear and casual wear, and less, formal or office wear.
They also own Athleta, which is a
They
athleisure
do,
brand, and
and
then
Banana.
Banana Republic. So they have a
Yep.
few options for that.
And I caught an article in Bloomberg, I think yesterday, mentioning that a lot of brands that had previously not been willing to sell on Amazon were going to Amazon. So one of the things I think is happening in retail is you're going to have these brands that maintain their value, but has businesses, it's unclear how they move forward. So what I think you could see in some of these cases is you're going to see brands get snapped up, whether it's Amazon or a subsidiary of Walmart or Costco. These brands get snapped up and put into a collection where your Banana Republics and Old Navies and Gaps are probably okay, but your one-off apparel brand companies may end up being grouped up and bundled.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, I think that
And
makes
remember,
sense.
there's still a lot of money flowing around in private equity and VC world. Like that cash is still there. Like they haven't been wiped out yet. They're being conservative, but the money to go make those plays, if you think you can get out of the debt obligations that exist in these bricks and mortar retail companies, kind of take the brand out and then relaunch a retail apparel company online, is
Mhm.
probably a viable business.
So, I mean, the biggest hit, I mean, and whether they're attached to, to a mall or not, most of them are, but the big department stores, I think, are the biggest sufferers right now. They were basically forced to close. Some of them do a better job than others of their online or e-commerce business. Like you said, Neiman has already filed for Chapter 11, I guess it is, bankruptcy protection. Dillard's does not, to my knowledge, do a ton of e-commerce business, so they're being affected pretty badly. I think in Florida they may be allowed to open up this week. Macy's, some of the other, I mean, they're probably getting hit hardest out of all this.
Yeah.
They're not selling low end casual comfortable clothes also for the most part, right? They're selling like work clothes, they're selling more formal clothes, so the demand is just
Yeah,
also
not
not going to
there.
be there for a little
No
while.
one went to a lot of Kentucky Derby parties this Saturday
Right.
where they needed like the big hat and the
Or a
white
cocktail
pastel tie.
dress or like a new
Yeah.
tie. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So the recovery for those businesses is going to be a little
Yeah.
bit longer.
So
And then you have the
consolidation.
interesting consolidation, I think, is something you'll see there. Now, look, if one of them, I mean, the same way we just talked about with some of the smaller, and I say smaller, they're still huge businesses, but smaller physically, um, retail stores, I think you may see, one or two of the stores that already had a strong e-commerce business that are well positioned, and it may be Macy's, maybe one of the other brands, snatch up
Yeah.
somebody that is just in a really bad cash position.
Um, so keeping us moving, the tech industry, this is probably one of the easier ones. What's happened to the industry since the virus moved closer to global domination? What are those industries trying to do? Global domination. And where does everything shake out by the rest of the year? They control everything.
Yeah.
Because
Global domination. Yeah.
yeah, I'm only being halfway joking about that. One of the things that's happened as we moved away from any in-person communication at all is having to have all of our communication moderated. That's become a giant opportunity for the tech sector. So for example, Zoom, which we're on right now, accidentally has become a consumer application. I'm not aware of any apps in the history of
Or
apps
maybe not
that
so
went from being
accidentally.
B2B to consumer. Yeah. When you look at Facebook and Google, I think near term, it's going to be difficult. Like their ad revenues are going to be down. I think they draw from big enough pools to recover that over time.
Hmm.
Um, Amazon is probably closest to world domination of them all. Another thing I've seen interesting behavior in tech is they have been extremely willing to help governments police content across their platforms. Now, you can make a argument, free speech, or is this good for society or whatever? But the strategy is really smart for those businesses, because what they are trying to demonstrate to governments is like they are partners, but not just partners, they are necessary. If you want to run a country or a world in the age of pandemic, like the tech businesses are required. You can't do it without them.
Hmm.
And so you might want to think twice before you pursue any real antitrust uh, prosecutions against them or cases against them in the future.
I
Matt,
mean,
what do you have on tech?
well, I mean, they had the natural advantage of, out of any industry, already being an industry that was familiar with remote work too. I mean, obviously there's some other natural
Yeah,
advantages they had going into this, but the biggest one is there was very little transition. I mean, especially for tech companies that are building, software suites or apps or products, they probably already had a fairly large remote workforce around the world, which meant that they already had policies and procedures in place for how that they do that. Probably already had a system, weren't trying to figure out how to use Zoom or Uber Conference or Google Hangouts or whatever it was, once this all started. Now, I mean, there probably was some adjustment. I know Twitter, pretty quickly in San Francisco, sent most of its workforce home to go remote work. But these are people that already had powerful computers at their disposal that
yeah.
were easy enough to use for video chatting and remote working. So out of all the companies or types of companies that had to transition, it was probably the smoothest on them. A lot of them, too, were probably eligible. Not the big ones, but smaller tech companies would have been eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program. Um, so they could have, kept everyone on the payroll. Their biggest liability there would have been, high payrolls that have to be met.
Yeah.
If you're watching us, you can see my dog Griffin, who just plopped down in his bed a little bit over my left shoulder. Um, yeah, I think that's the biggest advantage they had going into this is, one, they weren't dependent already on people coming and doing something with them physically. So what they're doing was not affected from a revenue standpoint. And then two, they were already well trained to deal with it from an operational perspective.
So that's tech. Let's think about DTC really quick. And it's kind of an offshoot of retail and tech.
It is.
I think when I look at DTC, the people selling face masks seem to be doing well. I see ads for face mask everywhere. That's pretty much all I get hit with. Um, I'm actually unclear on what's happened with DTC. A lot of those companies, the reason we've talked about this in a prior episode, they are not profitable on a per unit basis. And they have investment runways that they have to preserve. So what I think they may be is in a catch 22 where they've had to reel in their advertising spending to make sure they kept cash on hand, but in doing so they've also reduced their sales.
If they've done it, I don't think they've done it by any significant percentage. And this is anecdotal. This is just based on what I see in my feed and personal advertising. I have not seen a significant drop in DTC products online or even in over the top video. So in fact, I've seen some new DTC advertisements in OTT over the past couple of weeks for which I've never seen ads before. So Parachute, which is a bedding company, so like sheets,
Mhm.
comforters, maybe
Yeah,
pillows. I don't know.
interesting. So, I mean, that makes
They've
sense to me,
made a
Matt, because
they've
what
made a
I
pretty
one
aggressive ad buy, and that makes sense, right? You're spending more time in your bed, or at least spending more time at home. So
well, one
people
of
are
the things
thinking about redecorating.
I think you may have seen going on there is you had a set of companies that were into their, B or C or D or, whatever rounds of fundraising
Yep.
that realized like, man, they've been around 5 or 6 years. Like the game might be up for them unless they
Mhm.
can get to profitability. And the only way to figure that out is to live another 2.5 years.
Yep.
And that means reducing spending and trying to sell to existing customers again. But then you might have some upstarts and they only have a year and a half of runway anyway. And with ad prices down and people changing their habits, like why not go make the spending? Like
Yep.
you're a long shot anyway. And so your best chance is to move your product.
Yep. I agree.
Um, restaurant. So, recap here what happened to the industry during the virus. Either closed or went all carry out delivery. What are the industries trying to do? I think the industry as a whole has done a remarkable job of adapting. When I go into a restaurant for carry out or order carry out, like they've moved extremely quickly to adapt to the situation. Now, I don't know all of them will survive, but they've done a good job not not getting frozen in a business model?
Mhm.
And where does everything shake out by year's end, I think, is the big question. And so, Matt, Nipa, do you see people? How do you see restaurants in the next 6 months? Who lives to fight another day? Who just, hangs it up? It's not worth coming back.
There's a couple of big dependencies here, and I mean, the first one is I don't know how quickly people are going to be willing to go back in force. The problem is, in a lot of places, even restaurants that have been allowed to reopen have only been allowed to do so at 25% capacity, right? And 25% capacity in an industry where the margins are already razor thin is not going to get them back to profitability. It's not going to get their staff back to a full workload. But then the staff in and of itself, I think, is the second part of that problem. Um, the unemployment between the federal and state unemployment that has happened, you've got employees that it is much more profitable for them to continue collecting unemployment through the end of July than it is to go back to work. Which means that those restaurants are going to have to sit until August 1st before they likely have the ability, even if they can open, before they have the ability to hire their full workforce.
Yeah. Um,
With
I
full unemployment in most states right now, between federal and state, you can make almost $1,000 a week, which is a salary of $48,000 a year, which is probably a little bit higher than a lot of restaurant
especially
employees were
consider,
taking home.
you're a server and the risk is like, man, I go back, like, what if it's slow?
Yep,
What if it's just slow for a month?
sure.
Lose
So I,
tips. Yeah, you lose
yeah,
tips
there's
and
tips.
you also it's that personal risk too. I mean, the virus is still there. You're going out in a restaurant
Yeah.
and exposing yourself to people.
So one thing I've seen that for restaurants, and I don't, they may do an order that changes this a little bit, gives them some more flexibility, or they may have to have some accountants that get clever, is with the Paycheck Protection Program. There's tons of restaurants that have applied for it, and presumably plenty of them that have been accepted. The problem is that the forgivability of that loan is completely dependent on keeping everyone on payroll at the same rate. For an industry that is largely dependent on tips, that means you either, one, are going to have staff that are not making the same amount of money they were before, and you're going to end up with some of that loan that is unforgivable, or you have to pay that staff now a much higher hourly wage. You can't get away with
Tip
the
credit.
server wage, yeah, and
Yeah.
then tips on top of it. But then you have this dilemma of, in order to make up for that, are restaurants going to keep tips in order to trade off for paying those servers a better hourly wage? But then does that create animosity with the staff? So, I mean, restaurants have this really complex set of challenges far beyond can they get people to come back and sit down and have dinner with them.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a labor side and it's a customer side.
Yeah.
Another piece I think of the restaurant puzzle is in one of the things I was noticing this weekend is, man, part of the value of a restaurant isn't just that they make your food, it's that they like clean up your dishes and it's the presentation of the food on the plate. Right. And so I think there's some restaurants where even by the time you get it home, if you pick it up and you're 10 minutes away from your home, it's just not the same experience once it's been in
Sure.
the styrofoam or so, and I think you could see some innovations in the takeout space. Like right now it's kind of like dump it in a box and you're on your way.
Yeah.
I think you see some innovations in how food is presented
So,
in
I
a
mean, we've
takeout.
seen, even just here in Tallahassee, we've seen some Italian restaurants that have gone from, pizza being a minor part of their menu to being a major part of their menu, but they're doing it as take and bake, right? So they make the pizza, they
Yeah.
box it up for you, they give you the tray to put it in the oven. So then you get home and you have a much fresher experience because it hasn't sat in a cardboard box
Yeah.
for 30 minutes or an hour
And the
waiting for it to be cooked.
semi-catered meal is something where, you
Yeah.
buy it and it's a full meal, but you get it home and there's reheating instructions for
Yeah, the
it.
family meals, yeah, or they
Yeah.
Family
cooked it
meals have been a big
halfway.
thing.
Yeah,
I
they've
think
cooked it halfway.
I feel like the restaurants who have been more adaptable from the beginning. One of the ones I can think of right now is one here in Tallahassee called Lofty Pursuits. From the beginning, they've been changing things up, and they went online immediately to order for takeout and delivery,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
put up plexiglass and stuff in their restaurant to protect people. And so I think it's dependent on how much they've embraced the change.
And how quickly,
Yeah.
because, people, over the last 2 months have been changing their habits. So if you were early on that habit change, you may have picked up a customer that you might not have had before just because you were one of the first people to be out front and
Or at
doing a really
least
good takeout or
taking a customer that was otherwise going to eat with you once every 2 weeks, and
yeah.
now they eat with you twice a week.
So, I think the restaurant piece is going to be one of the most interesting in the economy to watch unfold. When you look at restaurant and retail together, this is still an industry where it is largely small businesses, and that is not most other spaces. So, the consolidation in that industry and those two industries, I think, is going to end up being particularly painful because you're not losing these large corporate entities most of the time. You're really losing probably a business that's doing under $1 million a year in revenue and is closely held. It represents, the entirety of the wealth for a family. So, last one I have on here, Matt, is travel. Do you want to cover travel? I know this is a sector you think a lot about.
Yeah, travel's in a bad place. I don't know how long it's going to be before people feel comfortable traveling again at the rate they were, and even just February of this year. Um, and it's hard to say like whether hotels or airlines are getting hit the hardest. I think, and I say this with a huge grain of salt, but like I think hotels probably come out of it sooner than airlines do. Hotel, and only because people will be willing to get in their car and travel places before they will be willing to get in a metal tube and travel to them. And hotels, there's the option of getting to a hotel if you feel confident that it's been disinfected well. You don't have to interact with another human being outside of your own family once you get at the hotel, for the duration of your stay if you don't want to. So if you're going to do something outdoors, if you're going hiking, if you're going to visit a national park, you could go stay at a hotel and in theory, once you get your room key, not interact with another human being the entire time you're there. But I think it's going to be probably the fall before people are willing to get back onto airplanes. Now, for the airline industry, the biggest place that they've been hit hard is business travelers. I mean, they certainly like leisure
Yeah.
travelers. Leisure travelers are
And I don't
good.
think that's coming back. I mean, that's
Yeah,
another key thing. I
biz,
think one of the
business
things we've
travelers are
trained
a
people to do,
huge portion of airline industry revenue.
and we've just trained executives across, except for the salespeople, but the other executives, we've just spent 2 months training them that maybe you don't actually have
It's
to go there to
not,
meet with
yeah,
them.
it's not critical that you do that deal in person anymore. Now, I mean, I do think that there's going to be a wave, like once there's a signal that it's clear, there's going to be a wave of people that are willing to do it because they need to close a deal. They feel like they need the face time, but I think it's 30% of what it was,
Yeah.
a year ago. Um, and even like with our company, I mean, there's some places we need to go and probably some deals we need to work on in person. I think for me the biggest consideration is going to be not even necessarily the airplane, right? Like I feel, I would feel fairly confident, I would say probably in 4 to 6 weeks getting on an airplane if it was something I really needed to go do. I think for me the problem is the destination city, right? So like places where I'm most likely to have to go and do business
Yeah.
more likely to be larger cities where there's more likely to be still breakouts and problems concerning, right? I'm not going back to New York City for probably at least a year.
So, I mean, let's kind of wrap all these up, Matt, in from a marketer's perspective. What is so where do we expect marketing spending to be going? Who do we expect is going to be cutting and who do we expect is going to be increasing? And we've seen research on this. So if you kind of just want to sum up what the research says that we've looked at here.
Sure. I mean, I don't think travel spending comes back anytime soon. I just don't think they'll have the dollars to do it. Political spending, I think, will be relatively stable for the 2020 election cycle. Maybe it sees a 10% reduction off of what it was going to see anyways if people have a little bit less discretionary income that they're willing to put into a political campaign. But I don't think that most of the ad networks that were going to get political dollars are going to suffer too heavily at the hands of that. Um, I think D2C like stays probably fairly stable. I would say that it probably hasn't taken larger than a 30% hit of ad revenue just based on what I've seen in the marketplace. The real question is, does all of that other stuff come back, right? Most of the businesses that were probably spending $500 a month on Facebook ads a few months ago have probably pulled that for the time being because they
Yeah.
need that $500 to pay an employee or to make rent. And that's a huge portion of Facebook's business, right? They spent a lot of time when they went public designing that ad platform to make it really easy if you own Joe's Donut Shop down the street to just give them a few $100 every month to advertise your donuts to people that live within a
Yeah.
10-mile radius of your store. Um, they're not going to talk about that side of the business because it's spread over so many different customers, but that's going to hurt them pretty badly if they're not able to recover that spending pretty quickly.
Yeah, in a space we didn't cover here very much, I know we're almost out of time, was that media space. And I
Hmm.
think, to me, the trajectory of media outside maybe the major cable networks and a couple of the national newspapers is it's going to become a de facto subsidiary of Facebook and Google.
Yeah, and what we did talk about on the podcast a few weeks ago was how particularly print publications are getting affected by this worse than anyone. Is the single thing that has generated the most news attention in the past, probably since the last presidential election, um, is COVID-19, and most of these outlets are not able to monetize on that because they've made all the coronavirus content free, right? So there's no paywall,
Yeah.
there's less ads on it. So I think Digiday did a story yesterday on the very same thing. So maybe they were just listening to the podcast and got inspired to write a story about. All I'm saying is we talked about it first, but that's a really unfortunate side effect for the media industry that was already struggling, right? Especially the print media was already struggling from a financial perspective. There's thousands of reporters that have been laid off or furloughed across the
Yeah.
country, and now the
Uh,
single biggest attention getter they have isn't generating that much money for them.
Look, I think the net result is just going to be captured by the tech industry.
Yep.
Right now, it's kind of the majority of their revenues. It's like a
And the
frenemy
tech
thing, but
industry is trying to make that less painful, right? By they're giving out these grants to local news publishers, and they're giving relief money to local papers and local TV stations and whatever. But I think all that is just to set up and make it a little bit easier to swallow when they
yeah.
swoop in and start owning all of them. The same way media conglomerates did
Yeah.
in the mid to late 90s when they started swooping in and buying up swaths of local television stations and medium to
Oh,
small
yeah, that's a
size
good
markets
point.
across the country and snatch up small newspapers that were making $100,000 in profit a year. But that was good to put into a portfolio. I think you'll see Facebook do that because if they can control the feed and flow, that gives them
Well, they
additional
need the content.
advertising
I mean,
revenue.
what they
Yeah, they
need is
need
the
they need
content
content to
going.
put
Yeah,
ad
they
space.
need
Yeah.
content that feels organic, but is really professionally produced, but isn't ad content. And so that's the reason they're pushing
And
money
that they
into
can
these.
identify as reputable, right? Like they can point to it and say like, hey, this is not freedomeagle.biz, this
Well,
is
well,
this
they
is
get to
reputable.
control the authoritative sources.
Yep.
In the authoritative sources discussion is probably a whole other thing to cover, because what's really happening is the
Respect my
authoritative
authority.
source is whatever Google and Facebook or Twitter designate as the authoritative source.
Yep, for sure. Any final thoughts?
I don't have any. I mean, my mindset right now is I'm fairly bearish on the near term future over the next year. I don't think
Yeah, I
there's
don't
a
see how you couldn't
V-shaped
be.
recovery coming. I think the unemployment numbers, when they come out today or tomorrow, whenever it is, are going to be close to 20. I think by the end of the month, it'll show that we exceeded 30%, which will put us above the Great Depression unemployment at 25%. uh, you know, a fair amount of those people will go back to work, but I think it's possible you have a long-term unemployment rate that sits at 15, 16%. Like I don't have a whole lot
Yeah, I
of.
think the problem is when they go back to work at this point, right? Like
Yeah,
when they go back is a big deal because if they don't go back until August 1st, when those expanded benefits expire, we're talking about several months, especially going into a presidential election cycle,
yeah,
several months of bad unemployment numbers, um, less revenue being generated by these businesses, and thus a smaller tax base.
yeah, and less marketing dollars being spent.
Yeah, that too. All right. As always, we appreciate you joining us this week on the podcast of record. We'll be back next week. Maybe next week we'll actually be in the studio. It's possible.
Maybe.
Things are getting, I hope a little bit better every day. But until that time, we'll be bringing you the latest news each and every week, whether it's from home or from our very comfortable real studio at the office, that I just would be happy to be sitting back behind my nice boomed microphone.
It was expensive. It would be nice to use it again.
It would be the whole
Yeah.
office. Yeah, it costs some money. As always, if you like the podcast, if you enjoyed the content, if you found it useful, share it with a friend. But more importantly, jump in your favorite podcast app of choice. Give us a rating or review. That helps more people discover the show. In fact, we're actually about to hit, I think, either this week or next, a pretty major milestone of downloads. That's thanks to all of you tuning in every week. As well as the new people we've picked up. So, I mean, we've had a great expansion. Probably 20% of people that have listened to the show in the entire history of the show, have listened in the past or have downloaded the episodes in the past 4 months since the beginning of the year. So, welcome all of you new folks. Let's keep it going. So, as always, thanks for listening. We will catch you next week.